Welcome back to the KOAM Morning News. If it's Wednesday, you know what that means. It's time for another Wildcat Wednesday. Now, joining us in studio today is Wendy Powell and James Cooper from the K-State Extension Office to tell us more about not only an upcoming workshop, but they're also going to talk about an ag lease program. So welcome to the show. Glad to have you here on this early Wednesday morning, but hey, we're halfway to Friday. So one of the topics that you wanted to discuss is something that's an interesting start here is, you know, if you were in college, did you have a dog? Were you allowed? How did you know? So how does this all tie in?
Yeah, first, so did you have a dog in college? Were you allowed to have a dog in your college?
Okay.
Like, let's say your apartment complex.
See, I lived at home because I went to school locally, but I don't recall when I would visit dorms anybody having any pets on campus.
So how did they know that they weren't allowed to have pets, though?
That is a good question.
Yeah, it was probably because it was actually in their written contract that they weren't allowed to have pets. Like, if you can imagine having or renting an apartment or a house or anything without an actual written contract, it's unheard of. I mean, you don't hear about anybody not having a written contract when it comes to renting. Oddly enough, when it comes to ag leasing land, that's actually very uncommon. And so I would say the vast majority of leases are actually handshake oral agreements without any written contract whatsoever.
Interesting.
And so it makes it very important to have good communication between landlord and tenant. And that's kind of what this series is about.
Okay, and what does ag leasing itself include? What exactly is that? Because for somebody like me, you know, you were talking about your college dorm, an apartment, something like that. That is a concept that's pretty black and white for me. But what exactly is ag leasing?
And so ag leasing is basically, it's a relationship between landlord and tenant where the landlord gives or allows a tenant to have a certain amount of land that they can farm on or ranch on or have some sort of agricultural business on.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, that makes sense, but I just wasn't 100% certain. So, what is the importance of this workshop and getting folks to understand these agreements, especially like you said, since a lot of times there's not an actual written contract?
Yeah, so we're really going to be able to hone in on the communication styles. When we have these handshake oral agreements, a lot of times the agreements start out very amiable and you think you're going to get along really well, and then maybe that carries on throughout the leasing agreement time. But then sometimes things happen and things fall apart. So we're going to talk about that communication that's really important. We're going to talk about all the different things that maybe should be in the discussion and in the agreement from the beginning. Do you think, can you cut firewood if you are leasing land from someone else? Do you think you can cut firewood out there?
You would think so, because you're leasing that land. I mean, it's on what you're paying for, and that's what's out there, and that's what you're going to do with it. So,
How about hunting? Do you think you're allowed to hunt on that land?
You know, I'm thinking if I had a rural home I was renting, well, if I have plenty of land, well, of course I think I'd be able to hunt out there. So it sounds like there's a lot of interesting topics here to go over. And as you mentioned too, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway too is the fact that a lot of these are handshake agreements. There's not a contract. And we're going to talk more about that here in about 15 minutes or so. So we'll have you both back on here. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to cover more of this a little later in the show, and we'll be back with Health Watch right after this.